I think I can probably remember the first time I experienced anxiety. I was probably around 4 years old. I was at school, I was at a convent school. I felt very detached from my home environment. And I think really at the time I didn't understand what was happening to me, but my anxiety manifested mostly as fear of being alone, fear of being away from my mum and my parents, fear of being in a foreign environment. From that point on, it escalated pretty quickly. When I was about 4.5, I can remember dropping my thermos flask of soup on the floor, onto the parquet floor. And from that moment on, when I saw that glass in my soup, I sieved all my food through my teeth, really. Pretty much for 26 years following that. My fear of contamination and my obsessive compulsive fear of being killed or being poisoned by things was overwhelming, and it lasted right the way through till I was 26. All through school I would avoid things like chemistry lessons. I'd try to escape from anything that gave me any element of danger. The only thing I didn't do was veer away from sport. I mean, in sport, and especially playing rugby, I seemed to come into my own and my anxiety disappeared. But at all other times at school I was overwhelmed by chronic obsessive compulsive thoughts, fears of dying, fears of fainting, of choking. I had panic attacks. I had monophobia, which is fear of being alone. When I went away on school trips, or we went away for school games playing rugby or basketball, I can remember having panic attacks in the coach, and it was overwhelming. And at the time, obviously, I didn't have a clue what was going on. Maybe I was around 11 years of age. I can remember being in the car with my mum in the morning on the way to school, and she turned to me and she said, "What's wrong? You're very quiet." And I said, "I'm just scared. I don't want to go to school." And she said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I'm too scared of living and too scared of dying." And she literally turned the car around and took me to the doctor's surgery, insisted we see the doctor straight away. And of course, he immediately prescribed me some antidepressants and said I was suffering from anxiety and depression, which, yeah, the anxiety bit was right. But later on I started to understand that the difference between anxiety and clinical depression is pretty distinct. Very different experiences are also very different in their science, which a lot of people don't understand. And as I got older, I started to realise that I was different to other people. The way I thought was different. The way I responded to social situations was different. It was horrific at some stages. It was so awful that I didn't want to leave the house. But I did, and I tried, and I kept pushing myself forward. But it wasn't until I was 26 that I actually found a solution to this. So I had many, many years of isolation, anxiety, panic, obsessions, compulsions, even eating disorder. I had medications, I had various types of therapies, but nothing really worked. Nothing actually took away the core fear. And now, years later, of course, I understand that anxiety is disordered fear. And now that I understand how it works psychophysiologically, and when I teach other people about it, and they understand it too, they can do something about it, but do something scientific instead of coping mechanisms and management. You don't need to cope and manage. You need the scientific solution. And had I realised that earlier, I would have had many years of feeling very confident, because ultimately confidence is a lack of fear of catastrophic outcomes. And when you don't have a fear of those catastrophic outcomes, you feel confident. And so many people misunderstand what this disorder and the manifestations of the disorder, whether that's anxiety, panic attacks, agoraphobia, or monophobia, or health anxiety, or an eating disorder, or self-harm. All of those are manifestations of the core fear disorder. And people need to understand the science before they can start to make a real recovery. So the real turning point for me was when I was about 26. I'd been to every doctor, every psychologist, I'd spoken to every counsellor, I'd sought out things like, alternative therapies and even the laying on of hands and, hot stone therapies and all sorts of different massage therapies and reflexology and Reiki. I was prepared to try anything just to get some relief. But at age 26, I had this moment of realisation, and it came when I was actually doing some volunteering. And the point came where I actually suddenly understood that when my brain was being used in a particular way, my anxiety was at a lower ebb. So that was the real turning point for me. It was the point at which I realised that it didn't control me and I could control it. But the problem was I didn't understand why. So I wanted to understand the science of the fear. Now, most people think that anxiety and fear are different things. You know, in colloquial language, people often say, oh, I did a speech at a wedding and I was very anxious, or you know, I did a speech at school and I was very fearful, or that makes me feel very scared. They don't understand that fear isn't actually an emotion. And when I realised that fear isn't an emotion, everything changed for me. But what do I mean by that? It's really, really simple. Emotions are things like happiness and sadness and jealousy, and these are generated in a specific part of the brain. And they are a mixture of endocrine response, chemical response, and electrical response within the neurology of your brain. But fear isn't like that. Fear isn't generated in the synapses in the brain. The responses that activate fear are. Now, this is really important because fear is actually an endocrine response. It's an emergency response that prepares you to fight or flee. So when the data comes through your senses into your brain then interprets that data by doing risk assessments that we call what-if thoughts, and then respond to those. This science was the turning point for me because it's the science that isn't used by psychology or psychiatry or any of those other practices that claim to be able to help people with anxiety. And this is why I hadn't recovered. But it's also the reason that I've helped so many people to recover. Because once you unearth this manifestation in your body and understand the psychophysiology of it, and more than that, understand how to use it, you can recover from anxiety conditions very, very quickly. And I liken it very often to being a personal trainer. You know, if you want to build biceps or triceps or your abdominal muscles, you have to do specific exercises that target those muscles, and you have to do them with repetition. There is no shortcut. It is the science of building muscle. So as long as you're feeding your muscles correctly with protein and other nutrients, and as long as you're exercising those muscles in a particular way, you will build muscle mass. I also liken it to curing hunger. Yes, you can cure hunger. Hunger signals are sent out by the brain to tell you that you need sustenance, that you need food, that you need carbohydrates, you need proteins, you need the vitamins and minerals that your body needs to thrive and to exist. So hunger signals have developed during human evolution to tell you that you need that sustenance. And the way to respond to that is to eat. So the cure for hunger is eating. The cure for anxiety is a very specific process. Because fear, which is an anxiety is fear disorder, is activated and deactivated in a very specific way. So unless the treatment that you're using addresses that science, utilizes that science, you can't recover. You won't recover, which is why so many people suffer for so long. Because none of the treatments available out there in the world actually use the true science of fear and fear disorder. Now, when I realized this, my life changed in days. Just a handful of days. Because when I realized what I could do to control the responses that fed into my anxiety and therefore fed into my fear, I changed in days. My panic attacks stopped, my phobias stopped, my OCD, my compulsive actions stopped, my obsessive thoughts stopped, the overthinking stopped. And the panic attacks, which at the time were about 8 to 10 a day, literally immediately stopped. Why? Because I utilised the science. And when I did that, my life changed so quickly that other people around me at the day hospital and people I was involved with through mental health at the time, because there was little else in my life, to be perfectly honest, they started to say, well, how have you created this change? And as I told them, they started implementing some of these things and their lives changed too. Why? Because it is the science of recovery. And that was the turning point for me, but it was also the turning point that led me to help so many people. And that was way back in 1996. Now I'm 57 years of age and I haven't suffered anxiety, obsessions, compulsions, phobias, or any kind of panic responses since that time, because I found the solution. When I meet anxious people, for me, it's quite enlightening because I hear many, many stories, and most of those stories are about things that I experienced when I was anxious. You know, there were times, especially when I was a kid, where I didn't like to be alone. I didn't want to sleep on my own at night. I'd lie awake feeling panicky all night. I'd have horrific nightmares if I tried to sleep. You know, all through school I had this fear of dying, fear of fainting. I was avoiding things. And then in adulthood, you know, even when I had, I met my wife, Beth, and we were first together, although I portrayed somebody that was confident, I wasn't at all. Inside I was being torn apart by the anxiety and the fear and the doubt and the obsessions and the compulsions. And, we'd be out somewhere for the day and all I'd be thinking about, I'd portray somebody with confidence and I'd take interest in what we were doing, but it was all an act, behind it all. I was so self-absorbed and self-obsessed, and the symptoms were coming thick and fast. And it was almost impossible to live a normal life, and I was modifying what I was eating, and it was just an exercise in coping every single day. And it was horrific because I wasn't enjoying life at all, but I certainly wasn't present. And, we used to go shopping and all I'd think about is, will I have a panic attack? How can I get out of the shop? We'd go to the cinema, or I'd go at one point I did have hair. So, I'd be sat having my hair cut and I'd be thinking, oh my God, I'm going to panic. I'm going to have to run out of here. I'm going to pass out. And it was just horrific. And to go from that to nothing at all, I never dreamt it would be true. I never thought I'd have kids. I never thought I'd have a family. I never thought I would be married and that I'd have a house or have a job or be able to cope in life at all. In fact, the psychiatrist, my dad went mad. I remember his comments when I came out from my first psychiatry meeting. He said to me, I'd never lead a normal life. I'd always be medicated. I'd always need to be cared for. And he described me as a tramp. He said I looked messy and dishevelled and dirty. I've seen the notes since, and it's quite disturbing to read those back because despite knowing what I saw when I looked in the mirror, I didn't really consider myself to be a mental and physical mess, but I clearly was. So the transformation was incredible and fast, but that's because anxiety, fear disorders as I call them, are so quickly remedied, and when you remedy them, they're completely removed. So all of those responses and compulsions and obsessions that just wreak havoc in your life and make you feel so desperate and alone and isolated suddenly go, and it releases all of your potential so quickly. And people come to us and say, but how long is this going to take, Charles? I've had this for 25 years. How long is it going to take? That's probably the most regular question we hear. And the answer is, I don't know. And the reason I say I don't know is because I don't know how compliant people are going to be. But it's like exercising. You can join a gym. It's not going to make you fit until you go in the gym and do the exercises. But this isn't difficult. Your brain doesn't want to be anxious. Your body doesn't want to be anxious. It's trying to forget the anxiety and switch off the obsessions and the compulsions and the panic attacks and the phobias. It doesn't want to be that way, but it hasn't yet been messaged. So what we teach you to do is message your brain and switch it all off, just like I did. And I remember when I recovered, 3 days later, I had to go back and see my psychologist in Birmingham. And I walked in and I'd had my hair cut and I was washed and I was wearing different clothes. I felt completely different. And he looked at me and said, what did you do? And my answer was simple. I'm not telling you, chap. I spent over £20,000 on psychotherapy and psychology, and it didn't work. So when he asked me what I did to cure myself, I wasn't about to tell him. But what I did do is go home and write it all down and start giving it away to people. And that's how this whole method was born. And now, since 1996, we've helped hundreds of thousands of people to understand their condition and move away from it. And that's what I want for you too, because it's just so simple. You don't need to suffer, you don't deserve to suffer, and you won't suffer just as long as you do with your body and mind what your body and mind are waiting to happen. You can do this, I can promise you. Over the many decades that we've been helping people to recover from anxiety conditions, you kind of get a consensus of an idea of what people have experienced, and also the mindset of the people that come to us, because many people truly believe that they can't be cured from an anxiety condition. And why is that? Because they've been told it. If you're told repeatedly that the reason you're not recovering is because you can't recover, and that the best case scenario is that you'll end up coming out managing or coping with your anxiety and the symptoms for the rest of your life, and you may need medication or repeated therapies, you kind of believe it, because the people telling you are the people that you've entrusted to giving you the truth. And the problem is, genuinely, that a lot of these practices and a lot of these people don't use the science of anxiety, don't use the science of fear. What they do is make assumptions about what it is you're experiencing. They try to tell you that some past trauma has caused your anxiety, or that the reason you suffer is because you're sensitive, or you're not able to in any way manage your fear levels when you're confronted with trauma or life practice, basically. And it's just not true. Everybody is born resilient. The fact that people are predisposed to suffering from these conditions isn't the issue. Predisposition doesn't mean you have to suffer. Predisposition means that you probably will, but it doesn't mean that you have to continue to, or that you need to manage your symptoms. And what we've discovered over the years is that many people get in this trap of believing that A, they can't recover, B, that the treatments they've tried have failed, or that they've failed in fact, and that the treatments aren't to blame at all. It's just not true. The problem is, it's like when I said earlier about eating to cure hunger. There's not a human on this planet that can't cure hunger with eating. It's a human preset. It's part of our evolutionary development that eating cures hunger, drinking cures thirst. And in the same way as those two things are absolute, so is curing your anxiety. Why? Because anxiety is disordered fear, and fear is activated and deactivated in the same way in every person. Whether you have the predisposition to developing anxiety or not is irrelevant. You can and will be cured, but only if you use the right process. And many people get trapped in this belief that the people they've entrusted to teach them and guide them and treat them are the right people, because they hold positions of authority, or they've got letters after their name, or they've got qualifications of some sort. But it's meaningless. If one set of people is, almost without exception, curing anxiety conditions, and one set of people are managing those anxiety conditions, who would you rather be with? So don't be misled by societal norms. Don't be misled by what expectations of other people are. Find the people who make sense. Find the people who talk about the science. Find the people who create the recoveries. And that is us. Because since 1996, in fact, so a long time now, we've helped tens of thousands, in fact hundreds of thousands of people to recover from anxiety conditions. And without exception, when they do as we say, they recover. Isn't that what every sufferer wants? Because nobody wants to cope or manage or take medication for the rest of their life. All they need is a quick and simple solution to their problems. The thing is this: I was you once. In fact, all our staff were like you once, and all of them have used this process to recover. And because it's the only process that's developed in humans through evolution to cure these conditions, it's the one you've got to do. You can't escape it. You can try other things, you can manage it, you can cope with it, you can do all of these alternative therapies, you can take medication and have psychotherapy, but you know as well as I do that none of it is working to remove your condition, and that's all you need and want. If you want to understand how your body produces these symptoms, why it produces the symptoms, and more importantly, how to switch them off, you need to understand the science, and that's what we'll teach you in very, very simple terms. And you'll not only understand how to get rid of your anxiety, but you'll also know how to release your full potential. Because every single person that suffers with anxiety has something deep inside of them that is unique to them. And that's what I call creative intellect. It's a deep, meaningful intellect, which means that you've got massive resources that will allow you to become whatever you want to become. You don't suffer because you're weak or frail. You suffer because you're incredible. And because that incredible power within you is using you at the moment, it's producing these thoughts and symptoms that you just don't want or need. But when you get rid of them, it releases potential that you didn't even realize yourself that you had. And I promise you, this is so simple. All I want you to do is try it. Just follow our lead, and we'll support you every step of the way. We'll guide you when you come unstuck or if you come off the rails. But the process is so simple and it works so quickly if you just do it.